Welcome everyone to Carnegie China's 2023 Distinguished Speaker Series. Today I'm delighted to welcome my friend and former colleague from the White House National Security Council, Dennis Wilder, for a fireside chat to examine current challenges in U.S. China relations and U.S. policy in Asia. So good evening for our friends in Asia, good morning for our friends in the United States, and then wherever else in the world you may happen to be tuning in from. In terms of background, Dennis is a research fellow for the initiative of U.S. China Dialogue on Global Issues at Georgetown University. Previously he served as the managing director. As I mentioned, Dennis served in the White House National Security Council as the director for China originally, 2004 to 2005, and went on to become the National Security Council Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for East Asian Affairs. Had a long run of 4 years doing that from 2005 to 2009 under the administration of President George W. Bush. That time included a number of presidential trips to Asia and China, including, in fact, and maybe we'll talk about it today, the 2008 Beijing Olympics, which seems like a very different time in U.S.-China relations. I had the opportunity during that time to serve under Dennis in the Asia Directorate as China director, and it's a hard job, the tough shoes to fill when you're replacing Dennis Wilder as the China director. But I was glad to have him as a mentor and continue today to really be grateful for that relationship. Dennis had a 30-plus year career in the Central Intelligence Agency from 2009 to 2015. In one of his last assignments, he served as a senior editor of the Presidential Daily Brief. That's the worldwide intelligence update that's produced under the auspices of the Director of National Intelligence. Very, very interesting job indeed. And more recently, 2015 to 2016, he served as the CIA's Deputy Assistant Director for East Asia and the Pacific. Too many other jobs to go through, and we've got a lot to discuss. Let me just say that Dennis comes highly qualified, and we're really privileged to have him as part of our Carnegie Global Dialogue series, and so Distinguished Speaker series. And so, Dennis, welcome.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you. You didn't serve under me, you served with me on the National Security Council. We had a great time, some stress, maybe a little bit.
Just a little.
With those North Koreans in particular, but really glad to be with you today. Glad to be with your audience here at Carnegie, and looking forward to our discussion.
You know, that was one thing that I was never sure whether I should thank you for or hate you for, giving me the additional job of being the NSC rep to the six-party talks. But nevertheless, it kept
you
it.
You should have gotten a medal.
And it was actually a very interesting time where things were actually happening and they were blowing up cooling towers and the like. Yeah. So in the end, I think it was a terrific assignment, additional assignment, especially as a China director, because it was an issue of strategic importance. Yeah. Before we delve into me asking you some questions and having sort of a moderated discussion, let me just set the context here, because we've had some near-term recent events that obviously will come into play in our discussion. From June 16th to 19th, I think, as most folks know, Secretary of State Antony Blinken was able to visit China. This, of course, was a rescheduled visit from previously that was postponed because of the Chinese spy balloon. This is the first time since the Biden administration entered office that Secretary of State Blinken visited China. And he was the first Secretary of State to visit China since Secretary of State Mike Pompeo in the Trump administration, when he visited back in 2018. So it's been 5 years since we've had a Secretary of State visit China, which is very interesting. Of course, we had 3 years of COVID during that time, and I think that obviously accounts for a lot, but nevertheless, an important visit. And Blinken's visit did follow a recent instances of heightened tensions in U.S.-China relations, including some near accidents in the South China Sea and in the Taiwan Strait. We had Chinese J-16 jet make some aggressive maneuvers in front of a U.S. Air Force plane over the South China Sea. And then we saw the Chinese Luoyang 3's disruption of an exercise between an American destroyer and a Canadian frigate in the Taiwan Strait around the time of the ShangriLa Dialogue in Singapore. And as a result, one of Secretary of State Blinken's main goals for the meeting was to resume a military-to-military communication between the U.S. That unfortunately did not happen. They were able, I think, to restart high-level political dialogue, diplomatic dialogue, and that, of course, is very important. And we may see some follow-on visits. Of course, he invited the Chinese foreign minister to make a reciprocal visit to the United States, and the Chinese foreign minister, Qin Gang, accepted that visit and agreed to schedule that at a mutually acceptable time. We also have Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen, who's expected to make a trip, Secretary of the Commerce, Gina Raimondo, maybe John Kerry as our climate envoy. And so these are all important in terms of sustaining that high-level dialogue at the cabinet minister level. But the military-to-military dialogue did not get resumed, and we'll talk about that during our discussion. Secretary Blinken met with, as I said, his counterpart, the foreign minister, Qin Gang, but also met with Wang Yi, who's the top foreign policy advisor to President Xi Jinping, and he met with Xi Jinping for about 35 minutes, and they discussed areas of friction in the relationship, areas of potential cooperation. In all his meetings, these were the topics. On increasing, for example, in terms of cooperation, the number of two-way passenger flights, potential cooperation on counter narcotics and fentanyl, food security, and other issues. Secretary Blinken's visit was followed last week, and I raise this now because I do want to talk to Dennis about this, by Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's state visit to Washington. Modi was welcome to a state dinner at the White House. He gave an address at Congress. He had meetings with President Biden, and those yielded proposed initiatives that would strengthen technological, defense, economic, and people-to-people ties between U.S. and India. And I think the juxtaposition of Secretary Blinken's visit to China and Prime Minister Modi's visit to the United States speaks to U.S. efforts to both craft an effective China policy as well as an effective Asia policy, as the two are highly interconnected. And so, fortunately, we're here to have Dennis with us today to discuss some of the strengths and some of the shortcomings of U.S.-Asia policy, as well as the future outlook for U.S.-China. So, Dennis, first question to you is just basic question. Obviously, you were watching Secretary of State Blinken's visit very closely. I listened to a terrific podcast you did with my good friend Kaiser Kuo, and I'd recommend folks to listen to that, which took place before the visit. And I have a chance to talk to you after the visit. Mm-hmm. What did you make of the visit? And how do you think it was viewed in the region as well?
Well, I think that the reasoning for the visit is quite clear, that the United States and China both feel that things have reached a very dangerous downward spiraling point, and that there need to be, as some of us have talked about, a floor under the relationship. And so I think that having Secretary Blinken go to Beijing was an important step in trying to, as some have said, get back to the Bali understandings that were made between President Biden and President Xi. I think, though, we have to be modest about what was possible and what was achieved. This floor is pretty thin. This floor is not what you'd like to stand on for a long period of time. It is a beginning point. It is not the building of a house yet, if you will. It's rickety, it's fragile, and there are a lot of things that can get in the way of moving forward. Nonetheless, I think both sides have shown an increased interest in trying to put the floor under the relationship. I think for Xi Jinping, I would say the economy is a very big part of this. I don't think it's coincidence that he decided to meet with Bill Gates a few days before he met with Secretary Blinken. We've seen a lot of the American company leaders going to China recently. I think the Chinese really have been worried about decoupling, or as we call it now, de-risking. And I think they've been worried not only about American companies, but European companies. And so I think they wanted to get the U.S.-China relationship back on a little better track in order to reassure companies. Companies, as you know, Paul, you talk to companies all the time, they don't like risk and they don't like uncertainty. And the U.S.-China relationship was becoming really uncertain. And from the point of view of companies, perhaps really risky because of the dangers over a Taiwan conflict. And so I think there was a lot of need that was being expressed by the business community, that something happened in a positive direction. And I think Blinken's visit was that first step in a positive direction.
That's terrific. And I agree with all of that. Let me stick on that last topic, which you mentioned, American business leaders. I assume you mean U.S. investors as well, folks that are engaged economically, commercially, investment-wise in China. And what's important there, I think you're implying, is some stability in the U.S.-China relationship. When there's too much friction, of course, that creates a lot of uncertainty. But at the same time, there's a number of things happening within China in terms of the business environment. We saw, of course, Micron come under a cybersecurity investigation. That looks to be some sort of retaliation for the semiconductor sanctions. But then there's a number of other companies, Mintz Group, Bain, Capvision, which is in fact a Chinese company, but nevertheless, that create a lot of uncertainty in terms of the business environment. And if China is trying to send the message that it's back open for business and that it wants to lure these investors and business folks back, or at least stop them from leaving, stop them from decoupling, why then do we see the kind of things that we see within China taking place? Right.
I think that's a great question. My analysis of what happened with these due diligence firms, and it's interesting that it was very targeted against a few firms, is that this was sort of, to use an American baseball metaphor, a brushback pitch by the Chinese. They were trying to say that these companies had gone too far. These companies were hiring people who were within the Chinese system, within the Chinese state system. They were using these people from the Chinese point of view to get state secrets. And I think what Beijing was doing, and again, it doesn't help with the relationship with foreign business, but I think what Beijing was doing was saying, this is close to espionage, and we're not going to allow you to go this far. And it was telling Chinese citizens very clearly, and they did a whole television program on this, that you may not engage in this kind of employment. That you are not to be basically selling China's economic secrets to foreign companies. So I think it was a particular incident related to the new espionage laws. I'm not sure they wanted it to send a broader signal, but you're absolutely right. It did send a broader signal. I think, though, I would look at some other things. One of them just happened yesterday, which is MasterCard and Visa have just been allowed now to use Tencent and Alipay in order for people to settle their accounts or to use WeChat and other electronic systems. This has not been available to foreigners in China before, as you probably know. I've been looking for steps like that on the Chinese side to show some forward movement. Another one I would expect at some point within the next few months will be Boeing. Boeing has not had a sale to China since 2017.
Mm.
Boeing has contracts with the regional airlines, under $7 billion of contracts that have been held up. I think we're going to see over the next few months, with the Raimondo visit and the Yellen visit and this attempt to improve the economic environment between the United States and China, I think we'll see the Chinese start to open up
Mm.
some of these. And I understand there are several other very big contracts that just have never been approved by the central government. So I think we're going to see a little more opening.
Very interesting. That's very interesting. So back to Secretary Blinken's visit. The one thing a lot of folks asked me prior to the visit was, why does it appear as though the U.S. is more eager for the visit to take place? In a sense, the Chinese kind of gave off a feeling that they could take the visit or leave the visit, that to them, it didn't seem all that important. In fact, Blinken and the Biden administration came under some criticism by Republicans on Capitol Hill for appearing too desperate for dialogue with the Chinese, and were accused of pulling some punches in some cases, maybe not taking some more competitive actions to make sure that the visit took place. Nevertheless, at the end, we saw long meetings with Blinken's counterpart, the foreign minister, over 7 hours of meetings, meeting with the top diplomatic foreign policy advisor, Wang Yi, and then, of course, a meeting with President Xi as well. So in the end, looked like the Chinese took the visit very seriously, and as you said, seemed to want that visit for their own reasons. But why the messaging, in your view? Why the signaling that, it's the Americans that want this more than we? What's going on in Chinese politics, potentially, in the U.S. China relationship, that leads to that kind of sentiment?
Good question. And I think that one of the reasons is the Chinese got themselves in a corner over the balloon incident, and still have not found their way out of that corner, by the way. It is very clear to me, and I think President Biden alluded to this in some of his remarks, that President Xi did not have an idea of what was happening. And certainly the foreign ministry had not a clue as to what was happening with that balloon. This was a PLA special operations program that goes awry, that was supposed to float somewhere else, and it hit the airstreams, and somehow the scientists miscalculated, and it ended up over Montana. The Chinese, have protected themselves from having to apologize by saying, you're overreacting. Well, I don't think we overreacted one bit. I think that the Chinese side just doesn't want to come to terms and want to admit what occurred here. So the Chinese, after Balloon Gate, took a rather, I think, unfortunate posture of basically saying, well, we're not talking right now because we're mad at you. You canceled Blinken's visit. You tried to make fools of us over the balloon, and we're just going to sit here. I think the question I would have for folks is, so what was the answer? Was the answer we were going to just sit and not talk to each other for the next 6 months, 8 months, 10 months? Somebody's got to make a move. I would also note that the Chinese did make a move. The Minister of Commerce came to the United States, met with Raimondo, met with Yellen on the margins of a G20 meeting. They did send Xie Feng to Washington as ambassador. So there were some Chinese moves. They weren't as big as our sending Blinken to Beijing, but I do think that they were indicating that they wanted to get out of the Balloon Gate mess that, frankly, they got themselves into. I don't think we should take any measure of guilt over how we reacted to that incident. It was outrageous. The PLA needs to be brought to heel by the Chinese government. The stovepiping of the system and the PLA's attitudes need to be changed by the Chinese government. I think you alluded to, and I won't go on too much longer, but you alluded to the incident over the South China Sea with this aircraft doing a thumping maneuver, we call it, against an American aircraft. That was way too reminiscent for some of us who were involved in the April 2001 of the mishap with a thumping incident of the very same sort by a Chinese F-8 fighter against an EP-3 reconnaissance aircraft that could have led to the death of Americans. It unfortunately led to the death of one Chinese pilot. But thumping maneuvers of that sort are a very dangerous thing and very unsafe. And it was deliberate. There was no question when you look at the video. It was absolutely deliberate on the part of the Chinese pilot. And one miscalculation in a maneuver like that, and everybody could be dead.
Yeah, yeah. And that took place just before the Shangri-La Dialogue, and you can find that video online. Made its way around Twitter, of course, just before the Shangri-La Dialogue.
Yeah.
You mentioned, you're talking about the balloon incident, and there is some speculation that the FBI is supposed to have a report out on that. Some say that maybe that's being, withheld because Biden administration is trying to improve the relationship, get back to dialogue. If we have, if we should not be regretful for how we handled the incident, basically calling the Chinese out for this, where is that FBI report in your view?
Well, the reports I've heard is that at least a first phase report was handed to the oversight committees on Capitol Hill. I think that there probably has been a debate in the administration over how you release this report. I mean, there are various ways to do this. Some of them more adversarial with the Chinese than may be necessary. A simple report delivered, for example, by Admiral Kirby from the White House, rather than an extensive FBI forensic report where you actually bring out equipment, may be the way to do this, to limit. I mean, there's no point at this point to be high profile about this, I think. But I do think the American public deserves to see the results of the investigation. And so I would not advocate holding back this report because of concerns of the Chinese reaction. I think again, Americans deserve to know what occurred here.
Two more questions on the Blinken visit, then we can move on to other topics. But our friend Bonnie Glaser put out a tweet shortly after the visit ended, focusing on the readout of President Xi's meeting, the Chinese readout, Xi's meeting with Blinken, and noted one major concern that she said that competition among major powers does not conform to the trend of the times. And, her point is the Biden administration has been trying to convince the Chinese to accept this framework of competition as the mainstay of the relationship and recognize it's essential to work together, as you said earlier, to prevent that competition from veering into conflict. Potentially part of the not willing to get back to mill channels may be part of this philosophical sort of disagreement between the U.S. and China. And my question is, why are the Chinese pushing back? I mean, clearly the Chinese are competing with us. You and I can come up with a dozen examples of where they're competing quite intensively. Why are they so reticent unwilling to accept the notion of competition in the U.S.-China relationship?
I'm going to go in an odd direction, perhaps, on you, Paul. Here, let me try.
I always expect one of those in our conversation, and I've been waiting for it.
There's an interesting thing, and I've been looking at it very closely. We all know about American exceptionalism, right? Our belief that we're a city on a hill, that democracy is a far better system of government than autocracy. And we have played this as part of our narrative throughout American history. John Kennedy referred to it, other presidents have referred to it. But there's an interesting Chinese exceptionalism that I have just started to really understand as I've looked at what Xi Jinping calls global civilizational initiative. And that is that there is a notion on the Chinese side that we have a 5,000-year continuous history, and that we are the world's first ancient civilization. And they are starting to say that we are a model for the world, in a way that they haven't said really in recent history. And in that model, in that not only the civilizational initiative, but the global security initiative, they have this whole notion of win-wins, peaceful world, common humanity. It's becoming a Chinese theme. And so for Xi Jinping, very difficult to accept the notion of competition. For him, it's an American idea. It's the American notion that there can only be one winner, is how they interpret that. That yes, we're going to have a race, but at the end of the race, there's going to be a loser, and there's going to be the guy who gets the medal. And the Chinese don't like that metaphor. And so I think that what you saw in Xi Jinping was partially this philosophical position the Chinese are trying to take, that that we need to find a way to have us all win in this competition. It's self-serving on the Chinese part to some degree, but I think we are seeing more and more, and The Economist had a rather good article on this. Xi is now cloaking himself in Chinese history in a way that Mao never did, and the modern Chinese leaders never did, because they rejected the dynasties. But I would have you look at the video of the Shanghai Cooperative Organization meeting in Xi'an. If there wasn't an imperial event, I don't know what that was. Xi Jinping is more and more wrapping himself in this imperial history of China, in ways that I think we got to start looking at, because I think we don't understand Xi Jinping if we don't understand that a bit better.
Yeah. Now that's a very interesting response, and I hadn't heard that before, but it makes a lot of sense. And of course, then that philosophical difference or different approach to these high level issues between the U.S. and China in terms of our framework for how we engage one another, then prevents other things from falling into place. For example, guardrails, which President Biden talks about, which he says are so critical, and the administration says are so critical to making sure that the competition doesn't veer into conflict. The Chinese side does not seem to be accepting this notion. And I heard from a Chinese interlocutor this week in a discussion when we were asking, why can't we seem to get traction on guardrails, mill-to-mill, crisis management mechanisms? We highlighted those two incidents you and I have talked about in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait recently. And the response was, look, at the end of the day, and I want to get your reaction to this statement, China is looking for strategic security. But what the US is looking for is operational safety. So the US wants to continue to do all the things that it's doing, even though China doesn't like it very much, but wants to make sure that its pilots and its sailors and its airmen are safe in doing that. And if something happens, that there's some mechanism in place to ensure it doesn't veer into conflict. How do you see that statement, and what comes to mind when you hear that?
What comes to mind for me is this question, and Representative Andy Kim at a Brookings conference recently raised it, which is, what is our end game?
Hmm.
What is the end state we are looking for in U.S.-China relations? Because if you look at the Biden policy on China, that question is not answered.
Hmm.
Other administrations, the administration you and I worked for, we were quite clear that the end state was two prosperous nations, China a responsible member of an international order that we had created, but that China now believed was in its best interest. The problem with some of this talk in Washington about Cold War, what was the end of the Cold War? The end of the Cold War was the demise of the Soviet Union.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, when we talk about, well, maybe this is a new Cold War in Washington, the Chinese say, okay, well, we know what the end game then is.
Yeah.
The end game is our destruction. The end game is the destruction of the Chinese Communist Party. And so I think that what they're trying to say is, what you are doing right now when you talk about guardrails, you are really saying, I just need some room to put pressure on you while I work to that ultimate goal,
Yeah.
which is your destruction. And I think that's part of it. And we have not been reassuring enough. Now, President Biden did say at Bali, apparently, that we did not seek the destruction of China. I think we need to reiterate that in stronger ways with the Chinese, because I do think it's a block in the relationship.
Yeah. No, I agree. I agree with you. And Mike Green and I penned an op-ed in Foreign Policy recently, and our third recommendation in that policy was that to articulate to the world, because our allies are so critical right now to our approach with China. They need to know what the longer term vision is for the relationship with China. And right now, the world is left wondering, where does all of this end? And I think, in the Bush administration, we could answer that question to a much larger extent. And I think that helped rally allies behind us. And I think the Biden administration would do well to engage with allies on the proper answer to that question. Where does this all go in the current geopolitical environment? I want to take questions from the audience as we go on. We do have one question related to what we just discussed, which is from someone who's watching this morning. How do countries in Asia view China's refusal to reopen military-to-military dialogue with the U.S. And the harassment that you mentioned, with the fighter aircraft and doing the thumping? Do they accept the Chinese argument that the U.S. should not be conducting exercise and reconnaissance in international water or airspace, or do they see this as, examples of more aggression, heightened aggression from the Chinese side?
Well, I think it's difficult to answer it for all Asian countries in one way. The Cambodias and the Laos and some of these other countries probably have a strong view in the direction of the Chinese position. I think it's probably a sliding scale across Asia. Certainly, I would think the Japanese and the South Koreans do not accept the Chinese position, because they see Chinese fighters and Russian bombers operating together against them on a routine basis. But I think what I pick up, and you're a better position than I am, Paul, to answer the question, because you live in the region. But what I pick up when I talk to diplomats here in Washington is a nervousness about all of this. They are very proud of East Asia's ability over the years to have avoided conflict, and to prosper, and to have a region of peace and security with the American assistance. And they're starting to feel the neighborhood's getting a little dangerous.
Yeah.
And that, of course, as we will talk about, I'm sure that they're being asked, what side are you on in this
Yeah.
struggle?
Yeah.
And so I think they want the heat turned down. They want to get back somehow to a less confrontational East Asia. One where trade dominates and people-to-people interactions dominate and conflict doesn't dominate the scene.
Yeah. That's a very, very good point. Talking about U.S. policy to Asia more broadly, is it your sense that the Biden administration has done a good job in placing U.S. In integrating Asia policy with its China policy? In the past, as you know, when you and I were working for President Bush, of course, we used to say a good approach to China starts with your policy and approach to the region first and foremost. And today, some commentators worry that U.S. Asia policy is becoming a piece of its strategy just towards competing with China primarily.
Right.
What's your sense? How can the U.S. engage with Asian states? Are they doing a good job doing it on their own terms without viewing it through the lens of competing with China? What's your sense on that?
Well, first of all, let me give credit where credit is due. I think that the administration, somewhat with the help of the Chinese, to be honest with you, has done a very impressive job of building the Indo-Pacific architecture of relationships. This is something we wanted to do in the Bush administration. To some degree, we didn't have the bandwidth to do it as well as we might have. But I think the Biden team really has done well all the way from the Koreas to Australia and India now to some degree in building up these military ties, intelligence ties, security ties that are binding. And I think that's great. There's a chance that we've overdone it, that we've been too good at this part, and that we're scaring people and we're scaring the Chinese in ways that maybe we don't need to, that there needs to be more diplomatic assurance that we are not trying to encircle China, we are not trying to suppress China by these activities. And so I think there does need to be some balance struck, and I'm not sure we're there yet. We'll also get to this in a minute, I'm sure, but on the trade side, on the economic side, we've been weaker than we've been on the security side. And
we'll get to that on your. Go ahead. We'll get to the trade stuff. On your point, when I attended the ShangriLa Dialogue this year after Secretary Austin's speech, I asked a Chinese scholar who I've known for some time, what he thought of the speech, and the response was very interesting. I said it reflected a higher level of confidence than the speech he gave a year prior. And I asked what he made of that, and he said, well, it's because he had a number of examples, concrete examples, of work that the administration had done with allies and partners in the region that is advancing, is moving forward and helping to shape the strategic environment around China. I thought the response was very, very interesting. But your point is also taken, which is, got to find the right balance in that. And of course, some countries are taking steps on their own, right, without the United States.
The Japanese reaction is extraordinary today. If you had told me 10 years ago that the Japanese would be moving in the direction of 2% GDP in defense, buying 400 Tomahawk cruise missiles, altering their ships to aircraft carriers, allowing U.S. forces to move to outer islands near Taiwan, being as supportive of Taiwan as they now are, I would have told you you'd be crazy, that this wasn't in the Japanese DNA today. But there is a profound change there.
And you have Australia now with its
Yeah.
own defense strategic review, really focused on China's military buildup as a focusing feature there. A great calling for greater interoperability with the U.S. to manage challenges from China. You got the Philippines, of course, granting access to 4 military bases. Korea has its own Indo-Pacific strategy now. And the Korean defense minister in the ShangriLa Dialogue this year highlighted an explicit military dimension to Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy. And I suspect there's more to come on that. So I think you're right. There's a lot happening in this regard. And as you say, a lot of it is just simply a response to what the region is seeing as a more aggressive China. Now, the U.S. and China, of course, they have their own narratives about their approach to Asia. The U.S. focuses on this notion of upholding a rules-based international or regional order. China talks about, or promotes Asia for Asians. Some in the region view the U.S. promotion of rules-based order as selective and serving, U.S. narrow interest. I hear some say, there's rules that the U.S. follows when it's in its interest, but maybe doesn't follow when it's not. So you hear a lot of skepticism in the region about that. But others, of course, worry that China's narratives masks its own attempts to claim an exclusive sphere of influence in the region at the expense of smaller countries. So what's your general sense on how these narratives are being received in the region? What are working? What narratives work for the U.S., what don't? And the same for China.
Well, I think that I am disappointed in one part of Biden foreign policy, and that is a bit of America first, a bit of protectionism. We certainly saw it in the legislation, the IRA and other things, and countries reacted to that. The South Koreans certainly reacted, countries in Europe, people in the electric vehicles field. And I think they had a right to react to that, because I don't think it's in the American tradition to protect industries in the way that some of that legislation was written. I think the administration's trying to soften some of that right now, which is great. But I do think it sends the wrong message. When we talk of free and open Indo-Pacific and free trade, we ought to, walk the walk after we talk the talk. And that has been an irritant to these countries. I do think that the Chinese narrative is suspect among East Asian countries. I think the Chinese did themselves tremendous damage in their relations with Southeast Asia by these unnecessary buildup of installations in the South China Sea. They could have had installations down there without making them so militarized and so large that they clearly were making a statement, and a very large statement, about who should own the South China Sea, essentially. And I think that China has proven itself to be aggressive in the region. And it's not just building the islands, it's their fishing fleets going out and being very aggressive. It's their militia, their seaborne militia going out and being very aggressive with these countries. The Philippine reaction is a logical one. The Vietnamese reaction to this is a logical one. And the code of conduct, which was supposed to be created, it's now been 20 years since that negotiation opened. And you have to ask, are the Chinese serious or not? And certainly, I would argue the code of conduct shows a lack of seriousness on the Chinese part.
Yeah. There was a question at the ShangriLa Dialogue this year from a PLA officer to Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin about ASEAN centrality. And the PLA officer said, on one hand, the U.S. States that it respects ASEAN centrality, regional authority of ASEAN. On the other hand, it maintains these multilateral participates and leads these multilateral coalitions like the Quad and AUKUS. And how does the U.S. reconcile its respect for centrality of ASEAN while also pushing and advancing these multilateral coalitions like the Quad and AUKUS? How do you see this question?
Well, I didn't answer a question you had earlier, and I needed to, which is how can the United States sort of have its China strategy and also work with these countries? I think the answer is we have a diplomatic corps. We have ambassadors in these countries, and their instructions should not be to press the China issue at every turn and to see everything through the China prism. These countries need to be respected. They need to be listened to. We need to deal with their issues and how the United States, and whether it's Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, whatever, Singapore, whatever country it is, we need to take them on their terms rather than see it all through a China prism. And so I don't think that's that hard to do. I think that proper instruction to our embassies and from the ambassador to their staffs are the way to go. And we have these structures overseas for this very purpose of dealing locally. In terms of ASEAN itself, we do have an ASEAN ambassador. We do try to work well with ASEAN. Dan Krickenbrink spends an awful lot of time, both here in Washington and in the region, working the issues. One of the things I would say to these countries, and I was with a group of young diplomats from these countries recently at Georgetown, and I said, you're thinking wrong when you say we don't want to be caught in between. Why don't you think about how you can exploit the relationships with Washington and Beijing?
I see some of that.
Right?
I think they're doing that. But yeah.
I think they are, and I think they should.
Right.
It doesn't all have to be negative.
Right.
The South Pacific Islands certainly found a way to exploit the situation to their own benefit. So it's not necessarily all negative for these countries.
True. No, in any competition for influence, you have an opportunity there to gain on both sides, frankly. And I said, again, to give the administration credit where it's due, I think on the Quad, I see a very positive, affirmative agenda, much more now than in the past, which is responding to the needs of countries in the region. And I think the administration's done a much better job at that. Public goods, right? That countries, areas that countries need and want. We have a question on the Quad from, and I'm sure I'm not going to pronounce the name right, Seng Hasnan Saring. What are the chances of the Quad evolving into a military alliance in the future?
Well, first of all, maybe I'll broaden the question to, will there be a NATO of Asia? I don't think so. Asia is very different from Europe. Europe is very homogeneous. The way that NATO was created made a lot of sense. I think in East Asia, we're not going to have a NATO-like structure. I think the lattice of relationships that we have created in the region are the way for us to go. It speaks to the diversity, the huge diversity of cultures and history within the East Asian or Indo-Pacific area that leads me to believe that's not where we're headed. I do think the Quad is fascinating on a level that I don't think people have looked at yet, or at least not focused on. Everybody's focused on the nuclear submarines. I'm agnostic on the nuclear submarines. What I think is very interesting is the idea of sharing at a very high level emerging technologies in the Quad. That is something, that's a line we've never crossed before.
Yeah.
And never committed ourselves to before. And I'm very interested to see where that takes us, because the nature of warfare is going to change dramatically in the next 10 to 20 years because of these emerging technologies.
Yeah.
I'm already seeing things being developed by the US military that just blow your mind in terms of operational capabilities that are potentially possible.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the Quad is going to, make its money.
Yep. And I think it's an underappreciated aspect of AUKUS, as you suggest.
Right.
It's part of that agreement as well. And it's the subs that get all the headlines, but really that could be, I agree with you.
Yeah, I think we do not yet understand how dramatic the changes are going to be in security policy, because technology is going to drive some very interesting changes.
And I agree with you on NATO, and of course, NATO and Asia. This is part of the Chinese narrative, and the idea, of course, is that you had NATO expansion and difficulties with Russia, and this has all led to chaos in Ukraine. And if there's a NATO in Asia, that ultimately will lead to chaos and conflict in Asia, and that's part of the Chinese narrative. And it doesn't get traction everywhere, but it gets traction in some places. I question the idea of opening a NATO office in Tokyo because I think, unfortunately, it sends a signal that much more is happening in that regard than it's actually just a coordination office. It's like one or two people. My view is that it is probably counterproductive if we're trying to send the message that we're not creating a NATO in Asia, which is what Secretary of Defense Austin talked about. I stopped you from talking about the economic side because I knew I was going to get to it eventually. But the U.S. economic strategy in the region is often discussed. Where I sit in Singapore, it's now embodied in this Indo-Pacific economic framework. Question for you is, is this, we were part of the founding members and part of pulling together the Trans-Pacific Partnership, now called the CPTPP. That no longer looks in the cards. Of course, China has applied to join the CPTPP. It's in RCEP. So China is either in or has applied to the major two trading blocs in the region, and we're not in either of those. But we put forward this Indo-Pacific economic framework. Is this, in your view, sufficient to advance U.S. interests in Asia, especially when you look at the lack of market access that is being offered?
Well, I think to answer like a CIA analyst, it depends. Okay. and what it depends on is our creativity. I follow the work of Wendy Cutler at Asia Society very closely on this, because she is a real trade guru and she really understands these things.
She was just out in Singapore recently, and we did a panel together for Caixin for their conference here in Singapore. She's terrific.
Yeah. Well, the thing that she focused on, and maybe she did in the conference you were talking about, is what's called the supply chain pillar in IPEF. And this is very interesting that they are coming up in IPEF with some very good ideas about supply chain resiliency, early warning systems, perhaps supply chain swaps. If somebody is finding they have a problem and someone else has a surplus, you try and balance these things, crisis management systems. I think that is really very innovative. And Raimondo is deep within this. So if we can find ways to make IPEF deal with some of the cutting edge issues like the supply chain question, then I think it could be very productive and very forward leaning. What it won't deal with very well is, and it's clear, is trade. And I deeply regret the decision of the Trump administration to pull out, and then the decision of the Biden administration not to fight for it. I think that has caused us damage in the region, and I don't think there's any way around that. But I'm a little more optimistic about IPEF because of what Wendy has been teaching me about the fact that there are ways to use this.
Yeah.
We just have to get creative.
On trade, of course, we have a trade deficit with ASEAN countries. China has a trade surplus. So to some extent, that does show that U.S. markets are open.
Right.
And that Chinese markets are, relatively speaking, not as open. So if that is the case, why are we losing the narrative on the trade side?
I think because we were such a leader in this area for so many decades, with our free trade agreements all over the world, and are pushing those kinds of agreements forward. I think it was a real signal that the United States did want all of these countries to prosper, and it wanted to be part of the prospering of those countries. Unfortunately, when we pulled out of TPP, we sent a message, probably unintended. I mean, it had a lot more to do with domestic American politics than it did our attitude toward these nations. But domestic affairs can affect foreign policy.
Absolutely. Well, we've got just a few minutes left, and I mentioned up front I wanted to ask you about Prime Minister Modi's recently concluded visit to the U.S. There's some debate about the extent of possible India-U.S. security alignment going forward. I want to talk to you about that. But just tell me in general, did you see the visit as significant? And if so, why? And what are the implications for our relationship with China?
I think the visit was extremely significant. Things are happening in India that are very interesting. American businesses looking much harder at the potential of India, and I think there is some potential there, although I think it's going to be slow in some areas. But what's interesting is that we are probably seeing the Indian end to this dependency on Russian military. The Indians have very much over the years bought Soviet and then Russian equipment. Their military forces are full of this kind of equipment, but they need to modernize. They need 350 new fighter aircraft, I understand, over the next decade or so. And they are looking west. They are looking toward us, the Germans and others. They just signed a big contract with General Electric for fighter aircraft engines. They just signed this contract for drones for use along the border with China. So I think that the Indians are moving a bit, and we certainly on the American side are wooing the Indians. But I think there are natural limits to how far India is going to go. And I'm not sure where those limits are, but we will bump up against them at some point here. I think we have to be realistic about India and its non-alignment and its preferences, and very deeply held preferences. So I do think the dynamic is interesting. I think the trajectory is interesting, but I wouldn't oversell it.
Yeah. And I'm sure you saw my Carnegie colleague, Ashley Tellis, had an important foreign policy piece, which addressed some of those limitations that we need to be clear.
I read his material closely on India because I know the expertise there.
Dennis, we've got 1 minute left. What should we be looking out for in the next several months on U.S. China? What are the key kind of signposts that we need to look for?
Well, I think that on the economic side, with Raimondo's visit coming up, I would look to see whether this can be a leading edge in improving the relationship. I do think there are ways on the economic side, as I alluded to, with some of the big deals that haven't been consummated with American companies. I think that there are ways that the United States can soften some of the export restrictions on China, not take them off. But as you know, with these export restrictions, there are exceptions that are made. They are built into these kinds of export restrictions. It's going to be interesting to see how that's done. It's going to be interesting to see how the outward investment executive order is done, because you can have a very high level outward investment bar, or you can have something that is more modest and that is easier on American industry and American companies. So I think on the economic side is where I see the progress in the run up to the APEC in San Francisco coming. Regrettably, I see on the military side absolutely no movement yet, and nothing to give me great optimism. But I do think on the economic side, we're going to see some interesting things.
Well, that was a tour de force, Dennis. And as
you.
always, it's terrific to discuss U.S. China, broader Asian regional issues with you. And thank you for participating in our distinguished speaker series and for joining the webinar this morning.
Well, thank you for your work from Singapore, and keep up the good fight out there.
Thanks, Dennis. Great to see you.
Bye-bye, Paul.